Apologies for that. I had muted myself. Sorry. Um, Question about the stateside units that are on prepare to deploy orders for Europe. President Biden said on Friday that what he said exactly was, I'll be moving troops to Eastern Europe and the NATO countries in the near term. So it seemed from that the decision to do this has already been made. It was only a question of when. And so can you say what would trigger that deployment to Europe from the US, aside from the activation of the NATO Response Force? Thanks.
Well, the NATO Response Force and what what the president was referring to aren't necessarily the same thing. That NATO has to vote on activation of the response force. I mean, that's something that would have to come from the alliance itself, and that hasn't occurred. We have shortened the alert status for more than 8,000 U.S. troops, but and they're making the preparations that they need now to be able to meet that shorter tether. But there's been no decision to activate it. As for the addition of forces or capabilities into the eastern flank of NATO, I mean, you heard the president make very clear what his intentions are. I don't have any announcements to make today. I don't have any units to talk about. But as I've said, and frankly, I've said it now for a couple of weeks, we're going through the rigorous work of providing options for the commander-in-chief, should he decide to do that, where and when he decides to do that. Obviously, in close consultation with the actual allies themselves. I mean, you can't just unilaterally decide to throw extra U.S. forces at a country. You want to make sure that they're on board with it and that you've had the appropriate conversations. And what I would tell you is that those sorts of conversations are ongoing. I'll leave it at there. Leave it at that. I don't, again, have a timeline to give you. I certainly don't have any specifics with respect to a redeployment inside Europe to talk to in any great detail. But it is very much an active discussion here at the Pentagon. It certainly is an active discussion that we're having with our National Security Council counterparts, as well as, and this is really important to remind, with our allies themselves. Court.
I'm unclear on two things. Okay, so what President Biden was talking about then is a unilateral deployment to NATO ally countries around Ukraine, right? That's
Yes.
what you're saying. Okay. Why? I know we've heard about, bolstering NATO partner defenses and Article 5 commitment, but the one thing I'm still unclear on is, is there any indication that Russia is threatening or has any plans at all to invade any of the NATO allies around Ukraine? Because it seems like everything we're hearing is that the threat is to Ukraine. So what's the Article 5 commitment that the U.S. has to allies around there? Or is it really just about showing a demonstration of force?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. I think, and you can see it in press reporting out of Europe, that the Russian buildup around Ukraine and in Belarus has definitely got many of our NATO allies concerned, particularly those allies that border or are very close to bordering Russia. What we want to make sure is we know that Putin has said himself how concerned he is about NATO, and this false belief that it's somehow an offensive alliance aimed to contain Russia or to threaten Russia. Again, false. But this is the narrative he's putting out there. And so we want to make sure that our NATO allies understand we take seriously our commitments to them. And so if they desire, if they want additional capabilities, particularly in those eastern flank countries, to bolster their own self-defense, then we want to have that conversation with them, and we want to be willing to provide that for them. That's the unilateral movements, and it really is designed to ensure NATO solidarity and, quite frankly, to help bolster the capabilities of our allies. Second and distinct from that, of course, is the NATO Response Force. So this is a 40,000 troop-strong response force that only NATO, the alliance, can activate. We have obligations inside that, just like other countries inside the alliance. We signed up for a certain amount of contribution to that. It is not something that is that's just off the shelf and you just go grab it. So you want to make it as short a tether as possible, and that's why we've alerted those extra 8,500 troops here in the States. They have not been given deployment orders. They've just been told to be ready on a shorter period of time in case the alliance activates that. And as for Ukraine, you're right. The principal threat right now, at least from a military perspective, is from Russia on Ukraine and to Ukrainian soil, which is why we continue to provide security assistance material to the Ukrainian armed forces. Another shipment just arrived on Friday. There'll be more coming in coming days, and why we still have trainers on the ground. Not just us, the Brits do, the Canadians do, trainers on the ground to help improve the competence and the confidence of Ukrainian armed forces. So it's really a multi-tiered approach here. But the president has been very clear. We're not going to see American troops on the ground in combat with the Russians in Ukraine. He has made clear that that's not on the table. So what we're focused on is the very real security commitments that we have. You mentioned under Article 5 specifically to our NATO allies. Should Mr. Putin decide to make or to exhibit threats against the alliance, we want to make sure that he understands unequivocally that that's not going to be acceptable, and the United States will fight to defend our NATO allies and our commitments to our allies on the continent. But look, again, and pardon me for going on, but it was a very good question. We don't think it has to come to conflict. We still believe there's time and space for diplomacy. You actually heard a little bit about from the Russians themselves that they're still willing to talk. So we believe that in that time and space, we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to be ready, just in case there was a need by our NATO allies, but also to allow for that time and space for diplomacy to occur. Did that answer, Tom?